Hello, Julian Schutze from Blood and Iron Martial Arts, here today with another fight analysis breakdown. Overall, the reaction to the previous one was very positive, so hey, here we are with another one. So here we have Steve, who's one of our instructors, versus Griffin, who's one of our intermediate slash advanced students. And got lots of interesting little things going on here. So I'm going to give it a quick playthrough once, and then we'll break it right down. So I particularly like this one because it definitely offsets, or not offsets, it demonstrates a general aspect of the fight, which is what's called the onset, or kind of feeling each other out for a bit. If anybody remembers that Saber video that Scalagrim posted with Lee Smith and Richard Marsden, one of the common complaints is that people were saying, like, oh, they're not actually trying to hit each other, which that's true, but sometimes that's not always the point, right? So for the first little part, both Griffin and Steve, they're just kind of feeling out what's going on, right? In a sword fight, one mistake means that you get hit with a sharp sword, you're dead. So generally speaking, when you're approaching a fight, it can definitely be a tactic to charge in there, but you don't always necessarily want to just charge in there, because then if you can't get a good read on your opponent, you're just going to die. So what these guys do is they start feeling out what's going on. So here, Griffin launches an attack, but he wants to see how Steve reacts when he goes to bar his sword. Steve is in a down low position, which Griffin knows that the only real way Steve can then threaten him is either to bring the point up for a thrust, or just bring the sword up in general. Either way, Griffin has the opportunity for a bar. So Griffin throws that out to try and control the sword, and predictably, Steve brings it up. However, after the initial impact, using a feeling, or in German fühlen, Griffin feels that, wait a minute, Steve's sword it's not a hard bind. There's pressure and it's going somewhere. So he knows that Steve's advanced enough that if it's not a hard bar, he went to bar the sword, but it gives way. Chances are Steve is now using that momentum to then come around for a counter-strike. And as we can see, that is what happens. If we observe the footwork here, Griffin comes in with a passing step, but then as soon as he feels that something's gone wrong, he can also visually see Steve's hands rolling up for like a nice hanging position. He cuts the footwork short, posts, and then pushes off of it to be able to generate some space. Steve's counterattack here was fairly light in nature as well. He just kind of threw it out there to see how Griffin would respond, and he noticed Griffin went up to roll to protect his head. In a perfect world, Griffin would not have this knee collapse. Oh, we got a save project there. As well as his hands would be a little further back, but in the same time, he recognized something was going wrong, and he immediately tried to get out of it. Which that's where experience starts coming in, is when you realize something's going wrong, and then you can get out of there in a perfect position. So, he recognizes that Steve has hit his sword, and Steve's bringing his sword back down, so he once again throws a counter out there to see how Steve reacts to it. They're not really in a measure to really hit each other. They're seeing how their opponent reacts to threat. There's so many different ways you can react to threat, such as if I throw a cut, my opponent could, well, either get hit in the head, they could roll up to a guard to throw a hanging counter, they could try to interrupt my cut with a controlled thrust. There's just so many different ways someone can react. You can't just go in blindly. So there's often a sense of feeling out what's going on and seeing how your opponent reacts to things. And that's exactly what's going on here. Their footwork, if anything, is the most telling, because at no point are they really committing at each other. They're doing a good job circling out, and they're doing a great job at keeping the outer measure. Here, Griffin threatens with the point. Steve goes to clear. Griffin uses that momentum. He notices that Steve is instead coming around on the same side, so he adjusts his guard position correctly to deal with a cut that's coming from Steve's left, or Griffin's right. And then once again throws a counter out there and anticipates a potential counterattack since Steve rolled up to an attacking position. But they both cut it short and circle out. Once again, feeling out the measure. Here, Griffin wants to see how Steve reacts to an angle change. So he starts up high, which is definitively like, hey, look, I'm coming from up here. But then he changes the angle the last second when he, or not the last second, but he changes the angle when he sees that Steve is starting to roll upwards and then throws an undercut from that position, which Steve notices, steps back, and blocks in his plow guard appropriately. Since Griffin managed to draw Steve out to this position, he decides to try to attack the other side, which then Steve manages to catch. And Steve here earnestly tried to throw a counterattack, right? We noticed he went for the block. He didn't step too far back for this block. If anything, he was stepping into this block, which means that his counterattack would be fast and in measure. But Griffin managed to block it. Probably just barely, but he did do it. And it's at this point that now Steve believes he has all the information he needs to be able to defeat Griffin, which is this sequence right here where he goes to control, swing around, and then strike. He strikes the inside of Griffin's right arm here. Unfortunately, this is a poor camera angle, but it was a good hit. Now, what led Steve to believe that he could get away with this feint, right? So he controls the sword, he starts coming around to the other side, but he knows that Griffin is just going to defend that side, so he pulls it, or does what's called a failure, or a feint. It rolls around the sword and strike. If we remember at an earlier exchange, Steve remembers that if he starts presenting with a threat, Griffin will go to guard perhaps prematurely, right here. So he knows that if after his clear here, after he clears away Griffin's sword with a Krumpau, he knows that if he starts presenting with a threat, Griffin will go to that guard perhaps a little too early, which then allows him the time to circle around it and hit the opening. So I thought that this was a very good example about what's called the onset and trying to read your opponent for perhaps failures in their technique or ways to find an opening in their approach. Overall, I thought this was a cool fight, and I hope you found it interesting as well. Have a good one.